At MidAmerican Energy, we're one company serving 1.6 million people who all need energy that's available 24/7. That's why we work 24/7. That's why we make investments in our systems that make us more resilient to extreme weather. That's why we generate power from all available resources to cover the variables in supply and demand. And that's why when the power is knocked out, we work around the clock to restore power to you. MidAmerican Energy, obsessively, relentlessly at your service.
And our panelists. My name is Olivia Cohen. I am the Energy and Environment Reporter for the Gazette, and I am hosting and moderating this session, The Biggest Bang for the Environmental Buck. Before we get started into diving into the session and discussing this topic, we just want to say a quick thank you to MidAmerican Energy, who is sponsoring this session. But diving into the session itself, there are lots of buzzwords that fly around when it comes to climate smart technology and how to use them. This session, we are working to ask on the bottom line, which climate tech is worth the hype and which are just greenwashing. For this panel today, we have Matt Russell, the State Executive Director for the USDA Farm Service Agency, Ann Kimber, the Director of Electric Power Research Center at Iowa State University, and Hannah Iman, the Chief Executive Officer for the Great Outdoors Foundation. Thank you to the three of you for being here this morning. For a little bit further of introductions for the three of you, I'm going to hand it off first to Matt to kind of take us through his experience in this. Matt?
Hi, thank you. And I'm getting a bad signal message. So if I'm stuttering or something, wave me down and feel free to move on to another speaker. So great to be with everyone this morning. I'm the State Executive Director for Farm Service Agency in Iowa. I'm a member of the Biden-Harris administration. My position is an appointed position. Employees in 97 county offices, delivering USDA programs to farmers and ranchers in county, about an hour southeast of Des Moines. And we have some cattle. We've done specialty crops and how we can manage our farm around conservation, and looking for some ways that we might be able to generate some revenue through those activities. So very much interested in this, not only in delivering things, but also in how our farm might participate.
Great. Thank you, Matt. Moving on to Ann.
As the director of the Electric Power Research Center, we do a lot of applied research with utilities and with communities in Iowa. I think one of the biggest, most interesting projects that we have right now is an agrivoltaics project where we're trying to look at multi-value propositions from a solar array that was originally developed by Alliant Energy on Iowa state land. We're looking at how that system could be used to also grow crops and develop pollinator habitat and support honey production. The reason I bring this up is it's a really different way of looking at renewable energy development and combining that with agriculture. I think this is not greenwashing. I think this is something that really could work for a number of reasons that we're studying right now with the Department of Energy project. The other kind of technology that is tried and true and should never be discounted is the role of energy efficiency in any kind of analysis of what the cheapest and most long-lasting technologies that have multiple values is. So we're working on a bunch of projects like around those ideas.
Thank you, Ann. And Hannah?
Yeah, hi, Hannah Inman with the Great Outdoors Foundation. We are an almost 30-year-old organization, and we really act as the nexus between public and private to advance innovative and impactful conservation projects. Our focus has typically been in working with ag and municipalities to advance water conservation and all sorts of conservation. Really excited to dive in today and to talk about the pros and cons of all types of conservation and climate smart work.
Great. Thank you to the three of you. Just jumping right into this session, just to start off, what kind of climate smart technology is currently shaping the environmental and agricultural fields?
Yeah, I can jump in with that. We're really on the cutting edge. I mean, there's so much to talk about. I'll try not to go off into the weeds too much. But the first thing is that when it comes to agriculture, for my whole life almost, the management unit has been getting bigger and bigger and bigger, right? So when I was a kid on our 1,000-acre farm in the 80s, we had fields, some small fields, some bigger fields. We had rotations. And, our management unit was maybe, 20 acres for that field or even 80 acres for this field. And as I got older, that just got bigger and bigger. So we were maybe managing a field, half a section at 320 acres. That was the management unit. That was a cornfield. In the last 15 years or so, we've turned that on its head, and our management unit's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And at this point, it is like a millimeter in some cases with GPS and technology. So we're able to manage our land in really much more creative ways. And how we're going to use that and what's the role for public policy, we're really on the very beginning of that, maybe the last 10 years, the last decade, and the next 20 or 30 years, we're really going to figure out how we implement all these things. So we're going to with agriculture, we need to stop emitting as well wildlife. We've got to turn all this around so that our farming systems don't degrade our environment on lots of fronts, but actually improve our environment. And we now have technology that makes that much more possible. And so that's kind of where we're at. And I can go more into things, but this administration, the last 4 or 5 years, we've put billions of dollars into thinking about climate smart agriculture, into just climate infrastructure, climate response infrastructure, and agriculture has been a big part of that. So I'll just leave it there with that notion that we're really at the beginning, and public policies can play a huge role as we choose how we invest those resources, and even in some cases, like we've been doing, expand those resources and those investments so that we can empower farmers and other members of our communities to really lead on solutions.
Thank you, Matt. What about on your end, Hannah?
I think that there's some really exciting advancements, especially with precision ag, as to what can be possible and what is possible, which is going to result in a significant investment, not only from public partners, but for the individual farmer. I think what will be interesting is how we respond with the delivery mechanism for conservation. We do a presentation all the time that talks about some of the barriers that farmers have in implementing conservation strategies on their field. And one of the biggest things is, NRCS and most of our conservation policies were designed in the 30s. And when you look at what is possible now, just look at the most recent tractor and like the See and Spray and some of the conservation or some of the agricultural advancements, we're not always matching funding and investment with what could be possible. We don't even know what kind of technology is going to be in the marketplace 10 years from now. And most of our policies and how we advance those are very specific to practices, which leaves out the ability to have innovation. And so we are really looking forward to seeing what some of the innovation is in how we get the individual farmer to be able to implement some of these new technologies in the future.
I'm going to speak to the nexus between energy production and use in agriculture, because I think that there's some very interesting technologies and ideas that aren't developed there yet. But when Matt talks about scaling, I think that there are some very interesting discussions and possibilities around knowing what the right scale is for agrivoltaics, or what kind of agrivoltaic system could we implement there. We can't necessarily do agrivoltaics with 1,000 acres. That's probably not going to work to do solar with corn and soybeans, but there's the possibility of dividing up that huge acreage into smaller, more interesting possibilities for more diversified agriculture. I'm not an agriculturist. I work in distributed energy systems mostly, but I think that there's just a lot of interesting things that could be developed that could bring new revenues to farmers, to communities through some of these practices that we're just exploring now. The other interesting thing is the whole drive towards electrification, not just for homeowners, heat pumps, electric vehicles, solar panels on roofs, all that kind of stuff, but also electrification of agriculture. When we think of electrification of agriculture and tractor technologies, we can also think about local fuel sources. For example, are there opportunities to use solar energy in league with hydrogen fuel cells to produce local hydrogen? Where is that going? Is there a possibility that that can be economical, that it could be used for local ammonia production? Can we be using biofuels in a new efficient and practical manner? There's a lot of, when you start to think about scaling, a lot more technologies become interesting to look at. So I think those are some interesting areas for innovation.
Great, thank you for that. Kind of in tandem to that last question, what kind of climate smart technologies are currently breaking into the mainstream when it comes to tech in this field, and which are kind of on their way out?
Which are on their way out. I'm just going to make a pitch for energy efficiency, because I think that we've kind of stopped thinking about energy efficiency. But we need it. So even if it's considered on the way out, it should be brought back into the spotlight and highlighted. The reason is that if you can build in energy efficiency into any practice that is being done, whether it's in your house, it's in agriculture, it's almost like having energy storage that's available at your fingertips. So I think it can be inexpensive, it's long lasting, and it shouldn't be counted out. Regarding new technologies that are coming in, I'll go to this very kind of nerdy thing of metering. Information is power, and advanced metering, smart meters are coming in. Some utilities are using them, and some are planning to invest in them. If customers could understand the timing of their energy use, we could open up a lot more opportunities to use energy more wisely during the day, whether that's on the farm or in rural communities or rural businesses, and that would help everybody. So I think information through better metering and customer awareness of the implications of when they're using energy very much leads to the cost of the energy and the sources that are producing it.
I would say that, we've been seeing, an astronomical increase of the types of data and the amount of data that's been being accounted for and collected. I think what's interesting is how we're going to use that data for decision making and how that decision making could be automated. So, for example, just on your regular farm field, there's at Iowa State, there is some technology where you can measure the nitrogen within a corn stalk, right, in real time. And so if you think about what that can do to your inputs and how you manage your inputs, it's really fascinating. And then when you start to talk about drainage districts and the automation of using some automated and mechanical drainage based upon the data collected, whether it's flow rates, and you start to look at storage within the fields, really you start to see what could happen in the future. And so I think what we're most excited about is how do you take the data to have climate smart decision making that can be on the farm level that has a larger impact. And we're just really excited about what that looks like in the future.
And I would say one of the things that I think doesn't get I don't want to say it's on its way out, but with all the discussion about the technology, the precision ag, big data, all of these things that are really important tools, I think sometimes we forget that the most cost effective and fastest point of innovation in the whole agricultural system is the farmer themselves. And so, I mean, farmer as innovator, I think, is really key to all of this. And and when you think about the REAP program with rural development, where we're putting hundreds and hundreds of solar installations on farms, on top of hog buildings, next to facilities that are drying grain, just wherever there's a need for electricity, that we've invested, through the federal government, we've invested in this incentive to encourage farmers to do this. And then every farm's unique, and every farmer's doing this in their own unique way and getting a really big bang for the buck. Not in every single case, but a lot of them are innovating in ways that are really adding value. And when you look at, Secretary Vilsack, he's been around the country now for the last couple of years, talking about the goal of this administration. So, lots of big dollars, but then how does that get, distributed and formalized through USDA? It's really looking at new revenue streams for all farmers. So when we look at some of these innovations, we could do this in just a way that is just bigger farmers, more high tech, and really consolidating. But we really have a vision of looking at those farmers as innovators, engaging them, and then figuring out how, with public policy and investments, but then partnering with private sector, that we're creating and incentivizing more revenue stream. And just, I don't have it with me, but I often have two props. When I was growing up, pulling calves at night, fixing the equipment, we had this big clunky flashlight, right? It had the big square battery with the springs on top, right? Produced a lot of light, but was very heavy, very clunky. Not, it was great at the time. Now I strap an LED on top of my head, hands-free. That LED has got 10 times the amount of light. It does extra things. It's using a fraction of the electricity. One of the most important ways in which we got to that was public investment. So we did a little bit of regulation. We did a lot of investment in research, and we really helped, as all of us taxpayers, we helped develop that industry, and we got a product that is so much better than what we had 20, 25 years ago. So, I mean, I think that's really part of the story too. Farmer is innovator, and how collectively we're going to invest in our programs and public policy so that farmer is innovator has a chance to get out there, put the best ideas on their farm. And what really makes this work is when those ideas that are great actually pay, that the farmer can monetize that for their operation. And I think that's part of what we're on the cusp of, right? It's what the next 10, 15, 20 years is going to be about. Are we going to really invest together through our democracy, or are we going to kind of step back and let the industry just kind of shape this? And I think we're going to get two very different outcomes between those two strategies.
Thank you to the three of you. Something I'm curious about is when someone is trying to implement a climate smart technology onto their farm or in conservation efforts or just to their work, what should they look for? What should they stay away from?
That's kind of a broad question. I mean, that could be a 3-day conference in and of itself. Probably should be. I would say, and this brings up some things that both Anne and Matt alluded to, is I think one of the biggest things that we need to tackle collectively in the climate smart and conservation space is technology is changing rapidly, and farmers aren't just doing conservation and climate. They have, jobs in which they're producing, and they're trying to make that, the bottom line for their business and for their families ultimately. And so when you look at the delivery mechanism to the individual farmer, how do we make sure that we're getting the right information that makes good sense to them, that allows them to access some of this innovation, but not at the cost of the vitality of their business. And so I think one of the things that needs to evolve alongside these technologies is how we are communicating, how we're teaching, how we're working together with the farmer to make sure that we know what is really working well and what isn't. Because the worst thing that can happen is that you have someone that's willing to change practices or to invest significant resources on their farm, and then the back end, the support is not there, or it's delayed significantly, or there's a lot of red tape. So that's where we see we're losing some of those early adapters to sort of the majority, is the delivery mechanism of information resources. And so we really hope that we can start to work together within the space with many different partners. The co-ops are ideal partners to be able to deliver to that farmer all the resources that they need as they start to invest on their farm, because ultimately that's where we will see success.
I want to jump in just from the energy point of view, that I think it's not just farmers, but people who are thinking about solar and battery technology for their houses or businesses. It's hard to find analysis tools that are understandable, that are easy to use, to figure out what the sizing of the solar and battery should be for the particular use, not just for what's happening today, but what they're going to do 5 years from now. So I think we need workforce development in people who are skilled at talking to all those people who are interested in investing in this equipment to figure out what actually makes sense. Because if we're trying to electrify everything, these are expensive systems to invest in. You need some credible assistance to figure out what the right set of investments should be.
I think another sea change that's happening right now is that we used to think of production in one basket and conservation in another basket. And what we're really seeing is the integration of those two, right? So really, it's like moving from conservation to ecosystem services. So in our systems, all industrial systems are economic systems, but just speaking specifically of agricultural systems, that this idea that we produce and then we set aside conservation, we're really integrating those, right? So that the conservation, the benefit to the environment gets baked into the system itself. And so as we're producing, we're reducing through that production system, we're reducing our pollution, our external costs, and ultimately we're building in benefits. And I think that's the game changer. And an example of that, how are we figuring this out, is Secretary Vilsack, through his authorities, used the CCC, the Commodity Credit Corporation, to do the partnerships for climate smart commodities. This is a $3 billion investment with 140 projects across the country. I think they're planning on about 25 million acres involved, 60,000, I think it was about 60,000 farmers. And we're in the middle of that, right? We've started that, and the Iowa Soybean Association here in Iowa got one of the largest awards at $95 million. And they are partnering with farmers across 12 states, putting these practices on their farms, and then understanding, like, every project has farmers involved in their fields at scale, getting paid to participate. And we're trying to figure this out, right? Like, what practices get baked into the production that deliver the ecosystem services. And a huge part of this project is, where are the resources from the private sector that are willing to invest in these as well, because there's value up the value chain for these benefits, and we've got to figure out how to account for them and then drive that revenue and that value back to the farms so that we accelerate the implementation. Really interesting stuff going on. But to your question, we're still trying to figure it out. And I think this is a great example of where, the Biden-Harris administration and Secretary Vilsack's leadership has really looked at how can we put some real investments, major investments, to try to get to come to some answers that will have real life consequences for farmers in rural communities.
And just to sort of highlight off of what Matt said, I think ultimately, making conservation part of the bottom line and showing that return has been really significant in advancing some of these practices, that it's not just conservation and production, as Matt said. But a lot of times, some of these investments in technology and practices may take 2 to 3 years to pay off and to really see an increase in yields or a decrease in input costs, or to have enough data for the individual farmer to see how it benefits their bottom line. And so that nexus of public-private partnerships is really important as we sort of continue looking at the farm in a holistic way and not decoupling conservation and production.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. We just have a few questions rolling in from audience members. One of them being, and I'm just going to read it verbatim. I'm wondering why it seems to be such a challenge for farmers to embrace technologies and practices which will actually improve Iowa's natural resources, especially with improving water quality. Do you have any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I can start. I mean, this is what we've spent the last 5 years of our organization really studying. So let's just take it on like the most simple level, right? Say you have a wet area, it's probably best to be put in a wetland. You don't have great returns there. You're mainly just wasting input costs. So the traditional way is you go to your local office, you may apply, and perhaps that year you had a great year, you have the money to invest. And a lot of the programs that are available for this maybe cost share at best. Sometimes there's a little bit more. And so you sign up to do that. And this is what we're talking about of we need to match technology with the delivery of systems, but it could take 3 to 5 years to actually, once you go through all the processes, to put that wetland on your property. So if you think of your returns, say 2 to 3 years versus on when you actually implement them, you might have a significant different farming operation, or it just might be a different economy. So for us, I think one of the biggest things is the barrier is that timeline of honoring people that want to do things on their land. In addition to that, the funding hasn't always been consistent to implement these new practices, right? People think, oh, we just put cover crops. Well, you need different equipment. I mean, you're learning a different way of farming. There's a lot of investment than just, throwing out some cover crops. And so when the funding isn't consistent or isn't always readily available, and it may take 3 to 5 years for you to see a return on your investment where it's really increasing yields, decreasing inputs, that's a really scary position to be in when you're talking about a commodity type business. And so I think that it's not as simple as just going out and putting a wetland on your property, putting cover crops in. In addition, as we said before, it's not their only or even their main activity. And so I think understanding how on the back end, the delivery of these things happen, we need to get better collectively of eliminating barriers, eliminating red tape. And one of the biggest innovations in that space has come out of Iowa, the Batch and Build program. It started in Polk County with John Swanson and a partnership with Iowans. And they did a pilot program on 4 Mile Creek. And so the traditional way was what I just described. And so what Polk County did instead was worked on a pilot project with Idols. We're going to go into this one watershed. We're going to have the conversations with the partners. We're going to sign up X amount of people, and then we're going to bring the technician. We'll find the contractor that will put these practices. We'll work with the farmer. We'll do a whole geographical area at one time. And then we'll take the cost up front and then wait for the reimbursement when we deliver these fully done practices. So the first pilot project for the batch and build were saturated buffers, and there were 200 statewide. So this pilot project was able to do 200 within the 4 Mile Creek watershed in just a few years, doubling the amount of saturated buffers in the state. So now that batch and build concept has caught on nationwide. We're seeing it being replicated in other areas. And right now we're part of a project with 11 different counties where we're doing batch and build with wetlands, which is sort of the gold standard for water quality, right? So what we were able to do there is eliminate barriers, bring the technicians to them, shorten the timeline for farmers from the moment you make the decision to the moment it was delivered was maybe a year. And so those are some of the innovations that make it easier for farmers to invest in these technologies on their farms.
It really well put, Hannah. I'll kind of go up like 30,000 feet. Farmers are making rational economic decisions. And sometimes they're making those rational economic decisions in kind of an irrational environment, right? So everyone agrees we need to improve our water quality. Increasingly, I don't want to say everybody, but for the most part, the ag industry and most farmers now are engaged in embracing climate solutions, right? So those are things that we all agree on, like we need to do this, but the economics aren't necessarily following along yet. And so if I'm really committed to these solutions as a farmer, the systems themselves are still driving some of the practices that we know aren't getting us to the solution, right? So we still have, so we know that longer rotations have big benefits, right? So if you do corn and then soybeans the next year, that has fewer inputs and better outcomes, external benefits, ecosystem services, than just corn, right? If you have corn, soybeans, and then a small grain, you get better outcomes, right? But on an annual basis, farmers are making decisions as to what their costs are going to be and where their return is going to be on an annual basis. And in some cases, the economics are still driving decision making that is that produces poorer outcomes, right? I mean, it still has production, but then some of the external costs. And those who are investing in things that create those external benefits, they can't take that to the bank, right? So that's why I'm talking about an irrational system, is that farmers are trying to make annual decisions on their farm. Where we've seen really positive effects are like CRP, where we're in conservation reserve program, where we're paying farmers to take that land out of that corn soybean rotation and put it into something else. And that whole idea of working lands. So we've expanded what those practices are. Prairie strips would be a good example, where we're using pollinator habitat to put infield in like 30 feet or a little bit wider, but minimum of 30 feet strips that the farmer can drive across, that the farmer can turn cattle out in the wintertime, right? In other words, that's an environmental benefit. Taxpayers are paying a rental fee, helping farmers pay the cost of putting that in, and it actually works as an infield practice, and it works with the production system. Those are innovations that are showing real returns. And so there's an example where a farmer wants to make the investment, and the public is partnering with them to do that in a way that's a rational economic decision for them. So I think, it's not just a matter of, well, everybody wants this and farmers should do it. If the economics are such that farmers that don't do it don't pay a cost for not doing it, and those who invest in doing it actually pay a cost for doing it, then we're not going to get a lot of movement in that direction. And if we flip that, then we see lots and lots of investment and acceleration. In other words, if the dollars that a farmer can use in their business incentivizes that kind of decision making, we're going to see a lot more of it.
I don't have anything to add except to say that the prairie strips concept, which is now a recognized practice, started at Iowa State University, and we're very proud of it.
Yep. And farmers were so important in that research, right? So that was an example of where Iowa State is partnering with farmers in their fields to figure things out, and we get really big returns when those kinds of partnerships happen. And this would be one of those.
Yep. Thanks.
Thank you all. We have a few more questions that are rolling in here. But before we keep going with those, something I wanted to follow up on. Hannah specifically talked a little bit about the barriers farmers and operations have when it comes to implementing climate smart technology. What are some of these barriers and how can people work through them?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not certainly an expert on these at all. I can just speak to some of the things that we are advocating for on behalf of all of our partners that have, really talked about this. So I think there's a big difference between, some of the climate smart money that has come through USDA and then some of the traditional types of conservation services that go through the NRCS. And so, and certainly the Inflation Reduction Act saw an increase in investment within those traditional services. That's really helpful. But for example, in Iowa, we're advocating that in the Farm Bill, we have a change in the technical service providers so that we can have more people on the ground in Iowa that can approve some of these plans. Right now, there's really only one person that can approve some of these conservation plans. So you think about all the wetlands and all the saturated buffers that we need within the state of Iowa to achieve the goals that we want to have. And there's really only one person that has the ability to approve those plans. That's a really simple way that we could increase the amount of willing landowners that want to place these projects on their farm. For example, we have a portfolio of $175 million worth of wetlands on farmland in Northwest Iowa waiting to get funding and approval. And so having more technical service providers allows us to fund those. And so that's one of the things that we're working on is to try to get some of those real world changes. And I would say that some of the climate smart grants that have come out of the USDA have really given a great blueprint in how we can do that in other departments and in other funding sources. So that's one of the things is just, getting more people to even be able to approve these projects when we have landowners that have the money and the willingness to do it.
I would just add to that. I think what you described for agriculture and getting approval of new wetlands, I think the same kind of barriers exist for trying to decide whether you're going to put renewable energy systems on your farm. Getting upfront financing to do that, or paying the upfront costs, and then getting reliable, reputable people to help you analyze what those sizes should be and what the benefits are going to be is a barrier.
I think part of the barrier is attitude, and I would go back to 2010, a couple of administrations ago, huge effort to do a cap and trade climate bill approach. This was sold as this is going to be really transformative, right? Lots of folks were excited about it. The agriculture community towards the end there got very skeptical of it and kind of collectively pulled back from it. And so I don't want to say farmers and the agriculture community, were the only reason that didn't happen, but they were a big part of putting the brakes on that. Fast forward to 2 years ago when we passed the Inflation Reduction Act and we put $20 billion towards climate smart practices. There are still some folks, there's still some farmers, there's still some folks in agriculture who are still skeptical of climate action. However, as an industry and collectively, farmers are now fully engaged, and we are not, as farmers, trying to put the brakes on that. We're actually now in kind of a making sure that those investments actually happen and that they stick around and that the value of what can happen with that is really baked in. So I think that's a huge attitudinal shift in, just, 15 years that that has really made a huge difference. And so if you are with an ag group, if you are with farmers and you're talking about these climate smart practices and the idea that we're going to invest in these on our farms and we're going to participate in solving this huge global problem and that there's industry that's going to pay us to be part of that solution, that has been a game changer. So I think continuing to develop that attitude where farmers are invited to be part of the solution, and like this administration making some really historic investments, not just the rhetoric of you're going to be part of the solution, but actually serious investments, game-changing investments on your farms and in our rural communities, across, energy in terms of on-farm energy production, some energy conservation. Those programs are still there as well. And then in-field practices and systems, agricultural systems that deliver these benefits. Huge game changer. I think we need to keep building on that investment in farmers so that attitude and that engagement keeps accelerating.
Going off of that, are there specific ways that Iowa is implementing this climate smart technology different than other states? What is Iowa doing differently?
Well, I think one of them that I alluded to is that batch and build pilot program that is now being done across the country. I think that was very innovation of delivery. And we're seeing, the return in spades for sure. I would also say that Iowa has been really competitive in the regional conservation partnership program, which is something that's been around for a while, but had an increased investment during this last Inflation Reduction Act. Iowa is always one of the most competitive states in applying for those. But there was a new program. It was the RCPP AFA, the alternative funding approach. And we have some of our partners within the state of Iowa have implemented that AFA model that allows us to get rid of some of those barriers that we talked about before, with, having delivery of services in a good time, et cetera. So I think we've been really proactive, at least from our partners, in being able to take advantage of some of the innovation at the policy level. I think what's going to be interesting is to see how at the state level and even at the federal level, how we start to integrate some of these new technologies. The nutrient reduction strategy, which is kind of our Bible of measuring outputs and things, is very practice specific. So when you talk about practices evolving and new technologies coming on board, how do we allow for that to happen, I think will be an interesting thing, not just at the state level, but at the federal level too, of what approved practices exist. So I'm interested to see that in the future.
So a little biased. I'm a graduate of the College of Agricultural and Land Stewardship at Iowa State. But I think that's another example of our uniqueness, is our incredible research institution at Iowa State University, those partnerships with farmers. But it's really education and research as a whole, because our community colleges are doing innovative stuff. Our private colleges, in the last 10 years, a lot of them have developed agriculture programs, right? So the culture of research in this state is really extraordinary. And that we still have a lot of farmers in this state. The vast majority of farms in this state are still family operations, are still mostly, at the family scale. There may be some seasonal labor involved, but it's really, families managing land and livestock that still is dispersed and individual. That's a real strength. So all of that together, I think, is a tremendous advantage and opportunity. And I think we're seeing things like prairie strips. We're seeing things like some of our innovation. If you go back to biofuels, that was farmers leading that. You go back to wind energy, that was farmers leading that. And I mean, not only leading it, in terms of ideas, but leading it in terms of shaping public policy to make that happen, and then leveraging the investments and the resources to make those things happen. So I think we're seeing that with in-field practices and innovation around climate, capturing climate on our farms, trying to pull carbon into our systems, and also reducing those emissions, cleaning up the water. Just a huge opportunity. We're unlike, there's really very few places in the whole world that have like kind of the trifecta, right? The land, the climate that really helps grow things, although changing, but most importantly, the people. We've got the farms, we've got the researchers, we've got the institutions, the industry. We've got young people who come from rural Iowa who really want to make a career in leadership in this space. And so I would just say, again, biased. I'm an Iowan lifelong, love the state. I'm a farmer. I love that, product of Iowa education, huge, unique opportunity that there's no place that puts it all together better than we do. And there's only a handful of places that can even compete.
I just want to add briefly, thanks for the shout out to Iowa State University. Iowa State has made huge investments in its research farms in order to demonstrate practices. And I would just say that the agrivoltaics project is a really amazing public-private partnership to demonstrate a wide variety of practices there right close to Iowa State. And if you're ever interested in a tour, we do them all the time. We've had over 500 people visit in the first year, over 30 tours. We're hosting people from the European Union tomorrow. It's a pretty exciting site. And we're already seeing differences in production in a good way for some of the fruits and vegetables that we're growing there. We're growing grapes under solar panel, white wine grapes under the solar panels. Anyway, it's just a really interesting and amazing partnership between engineering, economics, agriculture, entomology, horticulture, all these different groups. So I think it's a great example of how we're trying to be a leader in looking at these agricultural practices that have multiple benefits.
Great, thank you to the three of you. Kind of going off of what you were saying a little bit a few moments ago, Matt, talking about the family farmer. Can you talk a little bit about the accessibility difference between obtaining and implementing this climate smart technology for a family farmer versus a corporate agriculture company?
Yeah, so I'm gonna frame this a little bit first. So corporate agriculture in Iowa, the vast majority of the corn and soybeans, which is about 23 million acres, and then if you add, the hay and the forage, the grazing, so you got 30 million acres of agriculture land in Iowa. The only time you really get into corporate ownership and management is you've got seed companies that are doing some things. So there's a corporate entity. On the livestock side, you have ownership of the livestock that's corporate, and in some cases they may own the facility as well. So they'll have like a 5-acre location for managing and growing the livestock, and then a family farm owns the land around it. So I'm not trying to say that the discussion of corporate agriculture is not important. The consolidation, all of those things are really, really important and really important discussions. But I think sometimes what's lost in this discussion is that Iowa is still very much unlike even in fruits and vegetables. So corporate ownership of our fruit and vegetable supply chain is pretty significant. We still have a lot of individual farmers that are growing for those companies. But as far as corn and soybean and the cattle industry, and in some ways the poultry industry, and some examples in the pork industry as well, those are those are not corporate farms, right? And so really, I think the question is, instead of like industrial corporate versus family farms, it's really more, family farm agriculture, um, the management of those systems, and then scale, because we have some family farms that are really, really large, and we have some, most of our family farms are smaller, under 1,000 acres. So the question, I think, really is more, how are we incentivizing and partnering with the whole range of farmers? And I'll say this, that this administration, we are absolutely committed to figuring out how we have more farmers in Iowa, not fewer. And so then it's the question then becomes, are we making the investments so that smaller farms have access to this technology, that have access to these markets, that have access to our federal programs? Those are great questions. Those are great challenges, and they're not easy to answer. One of the things that we're doing in Iowa is that we have a working group for urban ag, right? So the whole notion of what does it mean to be a farmer? And so it's not just like farming in cities, but it's the whole idea of innovation. And are we creating an environment at NRCS, which is Natural Resources Conservation Service in our county offices, our Farm Service Agency, FSA, in our county offices, and even rural development, which doesn't so much work with farmers, but does work with homeowners and small businesses and rural communities and stuff. So this whole work, in Iowa State's part of this, and a lot of groups that are working with smaller farmers. So really thinking about, are we creating a culture of welcoming people into USDA programs and into our county offices, and that our county offices are not a gatekeeper, like, oh, you're a farmer, you're not a farmer. It's, hey, you want to be a farmer? or you are farming, but you haven't been in our office yet. So we're really seeing an investment across, all the agencies partnering with IDOLs, soil and water conservation districts. There's really big effort to shift our mindset and really invest in anybody that wants to be part of Iowa agriculture and farming. Are we creating an environment where we're welcoming them into the county office, into our programs, taking the time to walk through them, helping them understand if they're doing just a little bit, that gets them in the door, and then can we get them into a loan if they want to expand and grow? So I think that's a cultural shift, but also then all these programs that, as we're investing these dollars, these really billions of dollars, that we're also being conscious of, are we looking at ways in which we're opening opportunities for people to use these programs, be part of these investments? And jury's still out, right? We're still figuring this out, but I think it's an absolute critical and very important question. So I'm glad they asked it, but I just frame it a little differently, from corporate versus family to getting all farmers at all levels of all enterprises and all scales of farming operations involved and invited to be part of these solutions.
Thank you for that. Just pivoting back to some of the questions that have been submitted by attendees. Another question is, and again, just reading this verbatim, we are seeing agrivoltaics as a great use of ag land that can reduce conflict in rural areas over solar farms being put on prime farmland. Not just pollinator solar, but growing of table food and solar grazing of livestock. Thoughts from the panel?
So I think, it's early days to figure out how to make an agrivoltaic system work. What we have at Iowa State, and again, anybody is welcome to come see this, is a model of using like commercially available technology right now. So we're off the shelf stuff. It's not bespoke, as the entomology professor said. So we're using single axis tracking panels and fixed tilt panels at 2 different heights. That's the one thing that we're doing a little differently. And we are growing all these different crops under the panels in a scientific manner. But there's so many other things that could be done. We don't know which crop is the best for a particular area right now. We have some early information that Japanese beetles really don't like to be under solar panels, which is kind of an amazing result and is really great for grape and raspberry production, because I hate Japanese beetles. But there are there is some real potential that we're very excited about exploring, that grazing could be a really great combination of solar development with livestock production. One of the things that we know is that not all grazing animals are going to work for this kind of agrivoltaics. Cattle, it might be tough. We might have to raise the panels much higher, and that would increase the cost. But maybe there's smaller cattle that we could work with. Goats, no, we can't have goats because they they eat everything and they climb on the panels. So we know this already. But sheep would be a kind of a perfect grazing animal with solar. But the problem is right now, as I understand it, being a mechanical engineer, there's not a huge market out for either meat sheep or the wool from sheep. So we almost have to recreate, and I don't know if that's practical or not, a market for sheep, or know where that market could be, because it would work pretty well. And sheep are being used for grazing under solar panels at the City of Ames. Their community solar array, we've been using hair sheep that don't have to be sheared there, and it's being very successful. So I think that there's so many opportunities. The other interesting thing is how do you have to maintain vegetation if you're going to have vegetation under solar panels anyway? Can there be new business models that the farmer who is allowing their land to be used for solar, or who has entered into agreement for solar, did they become the vegetation manager under that array? They now have an additional revenue stream because they're developing pollinator habitat, or they're grazing, or they're growing horticulture, fruits and vegetables. We're looking at all of that, but I think there's great potential there. The other opportunity is to use vertical solar panels. We haven't looked at the possibility of just different technologies and how those would work, but we'll know a lot more about this by the end of December, when we have our data from our first harvest. That was a long answer. Others.
I'll just jump in. I think you said it really well, Anne. It's costs and benefits, right? And so how do you make the investment, and then there's a return on that, like there's benefits, right? But there's costs to that. So thinking creatively, and that idea of, so we're putting these on farms. Yes, we're gonna use, I mean, it's gonna be hard to put solar or wind or other clean energy on Iowa land that isn't productive, because we have so much productive farmland.
Right.
But the question of how we do that, and what are the additional benefits, and so engaging the farmer in another way to generate revenue and value, but then also, even if it's not a grazing system, but there's wildlife benefit, there's pollinator benefit, there's other benefits. I think you said it really well, and that's the challenge, right? We've seen that Iowa's been a leader in clean energy, and we've seen some pushback to that. When we look around, there are counties that are not that excited about having additional clean energy. So I think we do have to raise those questions. What is it about those that people are reacting to, and are we paying attention to that? And are we finding solutions, right? I think we can't be in a place where we're just saying, we're going to do this and you don't have a say in it. That is an absolute recipe for pushback. Yeah. But we have a huge opportunity with wind, with solar. I'll just shout out to Landis. They're doing a small scale solar operation that's generating that electricity, producing nitrogen, and they're looking at scaling that. But they're using technology that's coming from Africa, where they're developing very dispersed energy production. Now they're integrating that into Iowa. So some really fascinating things about scale and implementation. And I'll end that so I don't take up the rest of the time. But those are great questions, and it is where we've got to have these debates and figure this out in the next decade or so.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. We're just a few minutes away from running out of time here, but I just wanted to ask, Hannah, do you have any final thoughts or anything to add on the end of that question?
Not on that question, except for I think that both Matt and Anne speak to that the key in all of this is and to have success is to have an incredibly, we call it radically collaborative environment, where you have all the stakeholders at the table and that you're listening and providing stacked benefits, right? Which is sort of the epitome of Anne's work and the project. And that's really the key to making any of this work is, I think previously it's been, we've been on sort of these single track discussions that this is the only solution, this is the only way, and not necessarily listening to both sides and the concerns. And we have found that once you sort of break those down, the concerns and the objections on both sides, really the root cause is very similar. And so addressing those and creating an environment and projects where you have those stacked benefits, where you're acknowledging, all sides and really the obstacles that we have allows us to accelerate the pace and achieve our goals.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And a huge thank you to the three of you for being a part of our panel this morning. We appreciate it. And thank you to all the attendees who tuned into the session and sent over questions. It is much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Thank you all.